Mr. Johnson always greeted me with a smile in the morning. He'd flaunt those pearly whites shamelessly, just barely noticeable under that crazy mustache, you know, the one where it sort of looks like a crow has died trying to consume your nose, and he'd wave energetically as I walked down to my mailbox. I'd raise my hand idly and do the old good morning neighbor routine, but I'd quickly retreat to avoid getting trapped in a conversation. He was nice enough, but he was one of those extremely neat and extremely boring kind of people. If he caught you off guard, you'd be talking about the weather for hours. Mr. Johnson moved in next door a little over a month ago. The place had been empty for a year or so, ever since old man Gordon kicked the bucket. He didn't have many relatives, and it took them a while to figure out who'd be taking over the property. After 6 months the deed was signed over to his nephew, who in turn tried to flip the place post-haste. But because of the nature of his uncle's death, he was found rotting in his basement a month after he died. There wasn't much interest. Until Mr. Johnson came around. He didn't seem to mind the history of the place at all. In fact, he'd brag about it constantly, as if the rot stain on the concrete floor was some sort of trophy. It didn't bother me at first. I like a good cadaver story just as much as the next guy, but when you factored in the mustache and that holier-than-thou smirk, it became increasingly tiresome. And then I started noticing that he always seemed to have blood on his clothes. I don't know when it started, but I know that after I first noticed it I could not see it anymore. It was just so obvious, yet so indistinguishable. Every day, clean clothes, fresh blood stain. On his sleeve, on the leg of his pants, on the collar of his shirt, on the tip of his boots. Just a little drop, a vague smudge of red, a little hint of the old crimson. And his smile was fading. Just a tad bleaker every morning. A little broodier, a little darker. Until it was gone. I'd ask him about the blood sometimes. Just, you know, out of curiosity. You can't help it when you keep seeing it daily. You need answers. It's human nature. So, I'd say, what's with the blood? It's just paint, he'd say, avoiding eye contact at all cost. I've been redoing the basement. And so it went. Every other day I'd ask again, and he would reply with some incompetent excuse that wouldn't hold up in court. I believed him for a bit, I'll admit it. He did seem like the type that would redo things just to have something to blab on about with his golf buddies. But after the second week of painting, my skepticism was skyrocketing. And with the accelerated decline of his smile, I knew something dubious was going on. So one day I decided enough was enough, and just confronted him right there on the street. "So," I said, "wanna show me your basement?" He stared at me for quite some time, his mustache dancing like a drunk caterpillar, his eyebrows raising and lowering like pinball flippers. I could see a drop of sweat forming on his forehead, slowly making its way down to the root of his nose. His eyes darted back and forth like they were following a phantom laser pointer. "Sure," he eventually responded, "but, I'm not done redoing it yet, it's a bit messy." I just shrugged. "I don't mind," I said, "I just want to see how it's coming along." He nodded nervously and awkwardly ushered me up his driveway. I paced up to his door, and turned to face him. He seemed flustered, no doubt about it. He definitely had something to hide. "In we go, then," he said weirdly as he opened the door. I followed him in and looked around briefly as we walked towards the stairs leading to the basement. He'd really managed to fix the place up. Everything was sparkling new and shiny. "Very nice," I noted, "you've been hard at work, I see." He nodded and gave me a half-hearted smile. "Yes, but the basement is proving to be quite a handful." I followed him down the stairs into the basement. At first glance everything seemed perfect. Shiny hardwood floors covered the old concrete, the walls were painted in a tasteful crimson color, and he'd even replaced the old window with a stylishly profiled one. I raised my eyebrow inquisitively. "This is spotless," I said. "I thought you said it was messy?" He hanged his head in what I assumed to be shame. "Yes, but there's this thing." He pointed to the corner of the room, behind the sofa. He walked over to the sofa and motioned for me to take a look. I followed close behind and peered over his shoulder. "Ah, yes," I said knowingly, "I see what you mean. It keeps coming back," he complained. "I don't know what to do. It must be rust or something." "I have an idea," I said staring into the back of his neck. "Forget all about it." He turned to face me, his expression quite bewildered. I jabbed my knife into his jugular with some precision, and enjoyed the brief shower of blood before he sank down to the ground, a lovely pool of crimson steadily growing around him. It didn't take long before his heart gave up, and he just lay there motionless, his ridiculous mustache now slightly more tolerable tinted red. "Is that still paint on your clothes?" I said mockingly. I hung his body head down from the ceiling with a rope I found in his garage. The last remaining pints of blood dripped into the bucket below, the soothing clanks and glops like chicken soup for the soul. I studied the stain hidden behind his sofa. It would appear I had a leak, the brown-red mush gathering in a stinking pond looking all too familiar. I suspected one of the pipes of my acid tanks needed some fixing. It must have seeped into the foundations, eventually ending up here. Such a shame really, it completely ruined the new hardwood floors. When night falls I'll drag his body home and drop it into one of the tanks. It will take 2 days for the bones to dissolve. That should be enough time to fix the leak and clean up this mess. I seriously hope the next owner doesn't have a mustache. Commute to and from work is fucking dreary, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. 4 hours daily I'm stuck on a train. The seats are uncomfortable and the temperature is either too hot or too cold, they can't seem to get the fucking thing sorted. But worst of all is the people. I have a thing about personal space, and public transportation doesn't play very well with that particular type of anxiety. You've probably seen the joke about personal space in Finland. Well, Norway is no different. If you can keep at least an arm-length's distance, you do it. If there's an empty double seat, you take it. You don't fucking sit next to someone you've never met if you can avoid it. Talking to strangers on the train is a definite breach of the social contract. These are the rules, and they're not that fucking hard to follow. Mostly it went fine, you know. I'd hate it, but I would manage. I just put my headset on and fall asleep most days, waking up a few stations from my stop, and that would be it. But there's no fucking way I'm doing that anymore. I was heading home after pulling the afternoon shift. As always the train was jam-packed, but it would gradually empty as we got closer to my station. Usually there would only be a handful of people left at that point. I managed to find a window seat in the middle cart, and slouched down tiredly. An elderly man sat down next to me, so I just turned to the window and cranked up the volume on my headset to max. After the conductor took his rounds checking the tickets, I must have fallen asleep. I remember having the strangest dream, but I've never been able to describe it. It was like an emotion, or a sensation or something, like a feeling of being cold, broken and scared, full of anguish and despair. And it went on forever. It was like I was trapped in that dream. Like I didn't want to wake up, regardless of how bad it felt. I've never quite understood it, but it was like something was trying to prevent me from regaining consciousness. I had to struggle to wake up, like you would from sleep paralysis. Just force yourself to snap out of it. I came to with an aggressive jolt, completely covered in sweat. The train was too hot this particular day it would seem. A tall man sat next to me, his face concealed by the hood of his jacket. He was fiddling with what appeared to be a leather-bound notebook. I gazed out the window idly. There were still a few stops before my station. I sighed. My back was killing me, and I desperately needed to get out of there. I looked around the cart, and it was then I noticed it. It was fucking empty. This guy had fucking loads of empty seats to choose from, yet he decided to sit on the one next to me. He was breaching the fucking social contract. I did my best to control my anger, but I think I let out several disgruntled sighs, and shifted my position furiously to get my point across. He didn't seem to notice. He just sat there, stroking the fine leather of his notebook. It was just such a strange thing to do. I was utterly perplexed. I heard the crackling static from the speaker system a few minutes later. They were announcing the next stop. The last one before mine. I sighed again. Still 10 minutes to go. I secretly hoped the guy would just up and leave. He suddenly turned to me just before the train reached the station, and opened his notebook. "Pick one," he said, his voice dark and broody. "I'm sorry, what?" I responded weakly. He pointed to the open notebook. 3 strange cards were on display on the first page. They looked like old tarot cards, but the images were black and white, and quite frankly they freaked me the fuck out. "Choose wisely," he said. I still couldn't make out his face from under the hood. I shifted uneasily in my seat. "Sorry, I don't understand," I swallowed deeply. "Choose," he just repeated, pointing aggressively to the cards. I looked at the cards again. The first one looked like an image from an old book, maybe 17th century, and depicted a grisly scene where a man hung from a tree while a demon was removing a smaller person, possibly a child, from his abdomen. The image of the second one looked a bit newer, showing a white-clad woman carried by a human skeleton floating over a graveyard. The last one looked like an old black and white photography of a human skull in profile. "Last chance," he whispered hoarsely. The unspoken indication of the words sent shivers down my spine. With a trembling finger I just pointed to the last card. He nodded and took the card from the notebook. "Fine choice," he said as he handed me the card. The train pulled into the station, and the man closed the notebook and stood up. Without so much as a word he just walked out of the train. I let out a massive sigh of relief, and just sank down in my seat. That was some fucked up shit, I thought. Some crazy fucked up shit. I was extremely cautious the rest of that week. I always sat in the front, and never allowed myself to sleep. I never saw the man again, but I couldn't let it go, it was just so absurd. That sort of thing just stays with you, you know. That feeling of utter discomfort and uncontrollable fear. A few weeks later I got to work a bit late because of some delay with the trains. I was expecting some lip from my boss, but he seemed preoccupied with something, nose deep in his computer monitor. "Sarah," he said, "come look at this." I walked over to his monitor, and he pointed to the news article he was reading. Some woman had gone missing overnight, and the police were asking for any witnesses in the area to report to them. They couldn't rule out foul play, but they also had to consider other possibilities. There was a picture in the article showing the last location she was seen, just outside her apartment. I let out a horrified scream and stumbled back. "Sarah!" My boss yelled, "What is it? What's wrong?" In the window of the apartment you could clearly see it. Placed neatly behind the curtains. A black and white tarot card showing a white-clad woman carried by a human skeleton floating over a graveyard.